Last class you have learnt cell divisions and parts of a flower. In this class we will see pollination and fertilization in flowering plants. Let's see mechanism of sexual reproduction in plants. It involves pollination, fertilization, formation of seeds and fruit, germination of seeds. Now we will see one by one. First one is pollination. Pollination means the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of a flower. Pollination takes place in two ways. They are self-pollination and cross-pollination. First is self-pollination. This also takes place in two ways. They are autogamy and ketonogamy. Autogamy means the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of the same flower. Here, anthers and stigma is located very close to each other. Because of this condition only, this type of pollination occurs here. Example, mustard, brinjal, etc. Next is ketonogamy. This means the transfer of pollen grains from anther to the stigma of another flower of same plant. For example, this type of pollination takes place in cucurbits. Cucurbits means pumpkin, cucumber, etc. Once again I am repeating the same. Autogamy means pollination takes place in the same flower, and ketonogamy means pollination takes place in different flowers of same plant. Next is cross pollination. It is otherwise called as genogamy. Here the transfer of pollen grains from anther of a flower of one plant are transferred to the stigma of a flower of another plant of the same kind. Generally, pollen grains have a tough protective coat which prevents them from decaying. Pollination always requires some agents to carry pollen grains and release them on the stigma. These agents are biotic and abiotic agents. Let's see the biotic agents. Here, living organisms involving in the process of pollination. For example, insects. Many insects such as bees, butterflies and moths feed on the nectar of flowers. A few insects are attracted by the color and odor of the flowers. When these insects visit the flowers, the pollen grains from the anther stick to their bodies. When these insects sit on another flower, these pollen grains get rubbed off, causing pollination. Pollination takes place by insects are termed as entomophily. In some flowers, pollination takes place by snail is termed by malacophily. Example, peconia. Pollination takes place by birds are termed as ornithophily. For example, lotus. In some flowers, pollination takes place by a few biotic agents. For example, pollination takes place by wind is termed as anemophily. Example, grasses. Sometimes pollination takes place by water is termed as hydrophily. Example, hydrilla. It is one of the submerged aquatic plants. Next topic is fertilization. Pollination followed by fertilization. Let's see how fertilization occurs in flowering plants. You know, a plant is nature's gift. They provide us food, oxygen, shelter, clothing, etc. They are also known as primary producers. Like all other living things, plants are also showing certain features. Already we discussed about this. All higher plants reproduce by fertilization. Next, we will see fertilization. Fertilization is a process and occurs after pollination and germination of pollens. Fertilization means fusion of male gametes, that is pollen, with the female gametes, that is ovum, to form a diploid zygote. The method of fertilization in plants occurs when gametes in haploid conditions fuse to produce a diploid zygote. During fertilization, male gametes get transferred into female reproductive organs through pollinators such as bees, birds, etc. Finally, the formation of embryo in a seed. In flowers, when pollen land on the stigma, it absorbs moisture content which is present on the stigma and starts germinate. At that time, pollen develops tube that is called as pollen tube or germ tube. This tube passes through the style and finally reaches the ovary. Here, the male nucleus fuses with the nucleus of an egg inside the ovule, forming a diploid zygote, which later swells up and develops into a fruit. Let's say double fertilization. In plants, pollination is followed by fertilization. Once the pollen grains are deposited on the stigma, it forms the pollen tube. The pollen tube enters the ovule and reaches the ovary, where the egg cell is located. The pollen tube normally enters the ovule through a small opening called micropyle. Inside the ovule, the pollen tube releases two male gametes into the embryo sac. One male gamete fuses with the egg. This fusion is called syngamy and its product is called as zygote. The other male gamete fuses with the two polar nuclei and this process is called as triple fusion. Here, three nuclei are involved in the fusion process. One male gamete and two polar nuclei and its product is termed as endosperm. Two fusion occurs in an embryo sac is called double fertilization. After fertilization, the ovary develops into the fruit and ovules develops into the seeds.